Welcome everyone to Authors at BCFG. I'm Katie Milkman, a professor at Wharton and the co-director of the Behavior Change for Good initiative. And I'm joined by Angela Duckworth, a fellow professor at Wharton and of psychology who co-directs the Behavior Change for Good initiative with me. And we're really thrilled to have Professor Eric Johnson of Columbia University join us today to discuss his new book, The Elements of Choice: Why the Way We Decide Matters. And we're delighted that Caltech professor Colin Kammerer will be leading today's conversation with Eric. So I'm going to let them take it away. Thank you both so much for joining us. We're really thrilled.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for organizing this and letting me guest host, and for everyone who's watching. Eric, what's your book about?
So it's really only about one thing, which is choice architecture, but let me unpack what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you make a choice, you have a hidden partner, somebody who's actually helped you make the choice before you've ever considered it. So if you go, for example, to buy health insurance on a website, somebody's already decided how many plans to present you. So in New York State, it turns out there are 8 plans. In Utah, there are 160. I mean, that's going to have an impact on your decision, but you've not made that choice. So the book really is about and aimed at the people who design these kinds of environments. 2 quick things about that. One is that I want to call those people designers because it's a lot easier to say than choice architect. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is the reason I wrote it about designers is because we're all designers. So not only do we choose, insurance plans, but we also present choices to people around us. So Colin, when your son was younger, you probably told, how do you want to go to bed? Or what do you want to eat? You were a designer. So we're all designers all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. You answered 2 questions in one. And also that made me think that sometimes the designer's a friend, like a loving parent, or, a nonprofit maybe that's trying to help people get through FAFSA forms or get food stamps. And other times it's not, like in sludge. Can you add anything to that?
I think it's one thing in writing the book, I realized that I'm an optimist. So I'm actually assuming the designer is helping the person making the choice or the chooser. But obviously there's a side effect of being more aware of choice architecture, which is I think you can see when someone is doing things perhaps that aren't in your best interest.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. Basically, puts you on defense, and you can immediately see that there's hidden taxes or what's the loophole or why am I looking at this one and not that one. There's a story in your book that's so lovely about Sully, the airplane captain, landing his plane in the Hudson River near your house, which is absolutely fascinating. Tell us a little bit about that. It involves airspeed tape and load shifting.
Right. So it turns out that if those of you who have seen the movie remember the news event, he had 208 seconds between the time the geese hit the engine and actually to land the plane. And, if you think about it, there is a lot of things you could pay attention to, an enormous number of things. And he basically had to make some decisions about how to decide. And what he did was say, I'm going to do something. And there's a great quote. I ended up looking at lots of the accident reports from the NTSAB and things like that. He says, I immediately decided to goal sacrifice to save lives, and I will give up the plane, and to actually load shed. And he borrowed that from energy and providers. If there's a shortage, they basically decide where we're going to concentrate our resources. We'll do it in the hospital, hopefully, and not, a factory, and he said basically load shedding meant he was going to pay attention to a very small subset of the information. And it turns out there's this wonderful gauge in the cockpit called the airspeed tape. I guess years ago, there was actually a tape involved, but what it does, it combines 2 things. One is how fast you're flying and the angle at which you're flying. And, if you're thinking about it, you have no power. You're trying to make the plane go as far as possible. You can start doing calculations, but what this does, it combines the 2. There's an arrow and a green spot. It's actually called the green spot gauge in some circles. You try and line those up. And when you line those up, you'll fly as far as possible, saving him from having to do the calculations and letting him think about other things. Turns out the air temperature that day was 19 degrees. And so if he did a water landing, he had to do it someplace where people would be rescued very quickly. Turns out, backstory, he'd gone to the Intrepid Museum and which is right in the spot near the spot where he ended up landing. He knew there were ferry terminals there, lots of tugboats, and so instead of having to worry about, lots of other things, he basically could worry about where he was going to land. He didn't have to do the math. The gauge did the math for him.
Right. Yeah. And also that's a reminder of, while we often study heuristics and biases and kind of common mistakes people make, as we want to fix them and we want to understand mechanisms, there are extraordinary kinds of expertise, which are years and years of experience coupled with the design that enables this load shed. Dating. So your brilliant wife, Elke Weber, who's a psychologist and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and I happen to know does the New York Times crossword in pen fast, her guilty pleasure is the New York Times vows wedding column. Mine too. So maybe it's some secret behavioral scientist cult. Anyway, and so a particular vows wedding is a jumping off point for a story about dating sites and fluency. And by the way, Elke is a member of the BCFG team scientists. So there's that. Tell us about fluency and why it matters for things like dating site design.
And since you brought up Elke, I'll point out that English is not her native tongue.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Good point.
Is,
yeah,
I think
that's right. Yeah, she does it in a foreign language. Yeah, just to
so
flex.
Anyway, enough about her. Here's the thing: is that
Fluency.
I started looking at these because they were entertaining, and realizing they started putting in the name of the dating site where the couple met. About half of the couples in the U.S. now actually meet on dating sites. And what was really interesting about that is I kept finding that there was this one site called Coffee Meets Bagel. And I kept sort of inferring that people who were meeting there were actually more dissimilar. They kind of different from each other than, say, the ones who met on, let's say, Tinder. And I started looking at the sites and reading about them. And it turns out Coffee Meets Bagel originally was just one potential date a day. Whereas Tinder, there's actually a phrase in Urban Dictionary called Tinder thumb for when you get sore by doing so much swiping left and right.
Right.
And the cute thing about that is that actually, if you think about it the way that a psychologist might think about it, it makes you think about information. What's the easy information to look at Tinder? I'm not telling anybody that, probably appearance. And so what happens is there's actually, basically screening on appearance, and you don't look beyond that to look at other characteristics. In Coffee Meets Bagel, you might find out, it turns out this one couple I talk about actually found out they had great tastes, similar tastes in music. So it was really something they wouldn't have seen if they were doing that. And then when the cues actually, the things you're looking for are actually not easily predicted from one another. It turns out, by the way, there's some very nice work done that actually looks at this. Screening is very common. You can look at who people write to. And so it turns out men, at least one segment, don't write to women who are not much younger than they are. Interestingly, women don't write to men who are not at least 3 inches taller than they are. So they can don't tower over their potential date in heels.
Yeah.
So there's all this screening going on, and that's a function of how many options you present.
Yeah, that's a great example. And by the way, you have a beautiful chapter on metrics and number. And a fun fact about dating sites is there's a big spike of men who say they're 6 feet tall. There's a lot more 6 feet tall men than 5'11", which of course is biologically wrong. But in Europe, where 6 feet does not translate into a round number of centimeters, no spike. Anyway,
that's very cute. The other thing I talk about in the book, by the way, is that if people, who knows who would, but lie about their height, and you're looking for, and you look at height as a cue, you're going to end up getting lots of dates that don't measure up. Literally,
correct.
You'll get liars by looking for tall men.
You're selecting on liars. Yeah, that's right. And other directions for lots of other things, people that are fluent, but maybe overrated in this first wave. I'm absolutely smitten with meta-analysis, of which we've done some, and so I was really thrilled to see that you have a forest plot in your book. Congratulations on persuading your editor to include that on behalf of readers like me. Tell us what they are and why meta-analysis and reproducibility is a big deal.
So let me step back. There's a challenge here just for a second, which is if you're writing a book which you want it to communicate to lots of people and not get into the weeds, how do you describe replicable science and how do you get people to think about it? One thing I do is obviously I try and pick examples from literatures that, we know will replicate. So I think that's a really important and a challenge, because not by definition, not all the cute studies are necessarily studies that, there's lots of literature. And actually, by the way, when something is speculative, I try and say that. But I also do the same thing I do with my students, which is when I teach church architecture, which say, here's a thing called a forest plot. And all it does is say, here's every study we found in the area, and here's what the average effect is. And also gives you little ideas of how big the sample was and how reliable it is. So let me give a concrete example, default. So Dan Goldstein and I did some research on defaults and agreeing to be an organ donor. And that had a huge effect, 50%. And so lots of my students say, oh, all I have to do is change the default and I'll get 50% increase. There are even studies that do better. There are some very nice studies that have people choosing between green energy, sustainable energy, and non-sustainable energy. They show 80, 90% changes. But I don't want people who read the book to think that's typical. So it turns out when you do the meta-analysis, you can figure out what's the average size. And it turns out it's about 25%. But what's important is you sort of see what are the factors that make it bigger or larger, which if you're a user, if you're a designer, is useful. Other literatures, like how many options to present somebody, it turns out I won't say it's a mess, but I'll say it's sometimes really good and sometimes actually hurts. And what the science that's left to be done is understanding which is which.
Right. Yeah, those are two beautiful examples. The choice overload case is one where the pessimistic view of the meta-analysis is we really don't know if too many choices is bad, but really what it is kind of a wake-up call that we need to understand the mechanisms and sort things out much better. There's a really cool discussion in the book about restaurant menu psychology, and it's also where things are placed on a menu and how diners look at menus. It's also a great example of using eye tracking to measure visual attention rather than just guess, which you help pioneer a form of in consumer psychology, by the way. Tell us about the menu psychology, and then I might ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, so it started actually, I was having dinner with Richard Thaler. And, Richard, as you know, is a very sociable guy. And he started talking to the waiter. And he said, how do you decide what's on the menu where? And he said, oh, when we go to restaurant school, they actually give us a book called Menu Psychology. And so he said, Eric, you should include that. And actually the waiter was kind enough to actually email me back, incredibly nice guy, the title of the book, and I got a copy. And there was all this stuff and absolutely no research. It was just consultants saying things. And it turns out they think what happens is that there's something called the power position, which is in the right-hand side of the typical 2-page menu. And it turns out when you start digging, in fact, whenever people have actually tried to empirically verify that, it doesn't work. There is work done at the hotel school at Cornell where they actually did an eye tracking study of that menu, and people read the menu a lot like you would read a book. They start on the left-hand side, go down to the bottom, and then go to the right. And that just shows you a very different. If you're a designer, you want to know that, not what the consultant says.
Right. And so my follow-up is, why do you have any? Goes beyond your book a little bit. Any hunch why this kind of mythology would persist? I mean, the hotel school, which my sister went to, by the way, is a fantastic place, and there are a lot of other people in industry who are pretty sophisticated. Certainly, and now there's data analytics folks who look at restaurant traffic and casinos and hospitality. Do you have any hunch why that would persist?
Well, I think the story, and particularly calling it the power position, makes sense. Yeah. And there wasn't anyone for a long time who actually did the randomized control trial you would need to do that. And, it wouldn't be the first consultant that doesn't have empirically verifiable content.
Right, right. Or the last.
Right. By the way, one of the challenges in doing choice architecture, I think, for designers is actually when you don't have a simple answer. So if someone says, how many options you should present, we all would love to have an answer. 5. It's easy.
Yeah.
Now, sort of the key, I think, is understanding what are the processes that people are using. So, for example, it turns out that for number of options, it is true that people get tired the more options you present, but they also learn something about that. So there's a balance, and that number is not always going to be 5. It will be bigger in some cases, smaller in other cases. And I think it's really important to understand the process, sort of story of my career, the process to understand what it is to do.
What are decision simulators?
So one of the things that is really tough about doing a choice architecture is knowing what the right choice is. I can just say, here's a set of health plans. I might not know what the right one is for you. But just like Sully had a flight simulator, which he trained in. And what's more important is the cockpit he was trained in was designed by lots of people doing experiments on if we put this button here, that gauge here, will it work? And what's exciting about that, by the way, is there's a great quote I found doing this, which is basically, we're trying to give the pilot the information that they need exactly when they need it, and anything else is clutter. Now, if you think about most web pages, they're full of
A lot of clutter.
So the idea of a decision simulator is to give you, let's say, a web page, and then give you a task, just like the flight simulator says, you need to fly from Des Moines to LaGuardia. You would say, I want you to find the health insurance policy that gives you, good care for diabetes, if you have 3 kids and you're going to spend this much money. And so while I don't know what exactly the right thing is for you, if I tell you what the right thing is, can you find it? And so that's a way of actually deciding whether a choice architecture is good, whether a designer is doing the job, or whether they're not. And it's actually much more doable.
Yeah, it struck me, you talk about Netflix and recommender systems in your book. And that's an area where the designer's incentives and the consumer's incentives are pretty aligned, in the sense that they want to deliver a recommendation that is surprisingly good, that you really like, and builds up credibility. And I think the capacity of technology, in this case, partly from learning what you like and then matching you up with someone else who's very similar, collaborative filtering, the technology and the algorithms are really going to be powerful in doing good choice curation. Final question. You are a student of 2 outstanding social scientists who many people might have heard of or probably have in this group, Herb Simon and Amos Tversky. What did you learn from them that was interesting?
I probably could tell stories about both of them, but you asked about what I could learn.
Many
of the people watching this may not actually know Herb Simon well. He won the first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize in 1979. And one of the things that I think was very special about Herb, particularly in this day when everyone wants to be a generalist and know everything, he always described himself as being serial monogamous to the fields. So he made great contributions to political science, to organizational behavior. And by the time I caught up with him, he was actually doing AI and cognitive science. And he said the thing he did was actually pick a field, do it for a period of time, do it very well, and then move on. And so I think that's something that was very good advice to me. I have lots of interests. I probably, but maybe I've only had one idea, but I've tried to pursue it in a couple different disciplines. Amos, there's something I think anyone who's worked with him would say, which is he was really concerned with getting the science right. There'd be times you'd say, oh, we could write our way around that. And he said, no, we need to know exactly what's saying it. And anyone who's worked with Amos probably has, I had a experience where I think I went through 15 drafts of paper. Then you hand in a draft to him and it would be returned to you back, with 33% of the text gone. I think that kind of economy and effort and communication, and most importantly, getting the science right, was really an invaluable lesson early in my career.
Yeah, that's a really profound thought. And I remember also early when Tversky and Kahneman were working together, they were really shaking up the way people thought about judgment, particularly vis-a-vis economics, but psychology too. And I think they felt an extra responsibility. Some of it was just self-interest. Like, if we don't have examples in a story that's really rock solid, we're going to get heavily scrutinized and embarrassed. And they were kind of super careful, which is how science should be, but often there's so much career pressure and other things to kind of cut corners a bit. Great, thanks so much, Eric. We're going to turn to some audience Q&A, and again, you can send these in the Q&A bar, I guess. Howard Hirsch has a question. Can you discuss the difference between a deliberate choice versus a reaction when under stress?
It's a great question. And, we obviously make many choices a day. The sort of the classic cases when we think about eating, count each decision to take another bite of that delicious cake as a decision. This is caught a little bit, of course, by the distinction between automatic system one thinking and deliberative system two thinking. I mean, and obviously one of the interesting questions, I think they're both influenced by choice architecture. Just because you're doing system, I think, often fluency, which is how easy it is to acquire a piece of information. It's something we really didn't talk about, but the thing about Tinder is it's very easy to look at the pictures. It's harder to read the text. So that's why people look at that. I think it's actually going to occur in both cases. It's a really important question. I don't think we've done enough to understand how different tools for choice architecture might affect each of them.
Wasa Ahmad, sorry if I'm mispronouncing, has a question again about recommenders. Recommender systems do provide ability to alignment of interests, but coupled with other nudges, it could have a negative impact on consumers if they're guided to binging across shows and so forth. How do you think about ethics and choices here?
Yeah, I think it's a deep question. I've thought about it a lot. And let me say one thing that's interesting is, despite our discussion at the beginning of making people more aware of choice architecture, it's very hard. So the literature here is actually developing, but it turns out if you tell people, first off, you ask people, and did the default influence you? That is, I pre-checked one of the boxes. Did it influence you? They'll say no. Other people maybe, but not me. In fact, because you're doing a study, it did influence them. Right. So I think one of the real challenges, in terms of the ethics of designing choices, is basically what do you do when people don't know they're being influenced? And it turns out there's work done that where they warn people, and it turns out that doesn't seem to make a difference. So I think there's a real challenge. I think the challenge is really educating people more deeply about how choice architecture influences you.
Yeah, I think the fact that so much of it is subtle and sort of implicit, or we used to say subconscious, is a very important point.
We're also, by the way, too busy making a choice to also think about the choice architecture.
Right. Yeah, it takes the kind of metacognition, about what is going on while you're in the middle of, deciding whether to let Netflix catapult you into the next episode or something like that. Ryan Mubarak has a question. How should choice architecture change based on the type of product? For example, should there be maybe more or fewer choices available for harmful products?
It's a good question. And it
these are hard questions.
another point, which is basically, do you want to make it easy or hard to acquire harmful products? One thing with that the literature says, and I think is relatively good result, is more choices actually defer choice. So, I mean, I think it's an open question. I said I would be honest about when we don't know. But what it would suggest is that maybe what we want to do is actually do lots of things to make the choice less fluent and maybe be delayed, including giving you many options.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's not necessarily well known, is that extra choice doesn't just mean people choose and are dissatisfied or have a FOMO, what if I pick this other one? They may just not choose at all, like signing up for the healthcare plan. Katie Milkman asks, what elements of choice do you think are most frequently underestimated by practitioners? That is, people don't really appreciate their power. You mentioned defaults just then, and why?
There's certainly some literature on defaults. I wouldn't want to generalize that, but I think unless you're doing A/B testing, you have a website and you're Google and you're doing that, or you're a supermarket and you're doing that, I think order is one of the things that is not obvious, because it turns out order is complicated. You can understand order effects. It turns out that, for example, being first is good on short written lists, but if you're doing something where you don't have the consumer doesn't have control, like ice dancing, being last is best. So if the judges love whoever skates last in figure skating. And so there are reasons for that, but it's not going to be obvious to somebody because it's not an intuitive answer. So I would pick order as my second. But all of choice architecture is something I think many people don't appreciate.
Right, right. Yeah. Do you want to say something about ballot order effects? Because they're often pretty big, consequential, and your book has a beautiful discussion about like the politicians with the same last name and
Yeah.
and the
So,
hanging
so
chad.
there's
in the jury
certainly a
selection.
literature that's actually says it's, again, kind of interesting, but there's a perfect storm example, which is there was two
Yeah.
Greens running for the Republican Supreme Court nomination. And it turns out in Texas, they actually randomized by county which name appears first. So I think it was Rick Green and David Green. But whatever Green was first in the ballot got 20% more votes. Now, this turns out to be an extreme case, but if you look across lots of studies, in fact, someone like John Krosnick would claim there's typically a 1 to 2% advantage to being first.
Mhm.
And this is really important because, everyone knows that in some states, the governor, like Florida, picks who's first on the ballot. And that is a much bigger effect than anything due to, if you remember 2000 Gore versus Bush, hanging chads. No, it was who was first.
Right.
That was probably most important. But it turns out, just to be equal opportunity, it turns out in Delaware, the Democrat is first. So whoever is making that order decision is actually having a very heavy thumb on the scales.
Stephanie Fiorelli asks, how can you train yourself, back to something like the Sully airplane landing on the Hudson, how can you train yourself to be able to make those concentrated and targeted choices when disaster strikes?
So let me turn the question a little bit around and saying, we often think about the decision maker. I would want to say, is there a way you can put yourself in environments like Sully had? They're going to let you make that decision in a way that's easy and fast. I had a former student who was actually in medical informatics at Mount Sinai. And, a doctor interacting with what's called a health record system, electronic health record system, actually has a tough job. They're trying to type everything as they're talking to the patient. It turns out that the doctor actually spends about 30% of their time talking to the system in addition to the patient. So almost a third of the time is actually typing. And that could have a lot of influence. So one of the decisions doctors are making that is time pressured is, what drug do I prescribe to this person? And one of the things that's true is generics are a lot cheaper and often equivalent. And a generic actually is good because not only is it like 20 cents on the dollar, but it also turns out that generics are great because people are more compliant when you prescribe them because they can afford them. They don't sort of skip a day to take the pill.
And cut their pills in half and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. So doctors are really,
nice.
really having there are a lot of incentives, but they tend to stick with generics. And what Jessica found was actually that part of it, it's because they can't remember the name of the generic drug. Example is Allegra, which is an antihistamine, which everyone has seen before because it was on their pens when they were detailing. And now that it's generic, it's fexofenadine hydrochloride. They made one small change to make that environment much easier for people to use generics. When I started typing Allegra, ALL, it popped up as fexofenadine hydrochloride. And you could just with a click of a button go back to the non-generic version. But at Mount Sinai, that increased the percentage of generics from 46% to over 90%. And so it you didn't change doctors, you changed the environment. And that's sort of, so I want to take that great question and sort of say that, think about how you can arrange the environment to make it easy, reduce information that's not relevant, get rid of the clutter, and make the information that's helpful more available. And if you can calculate things, do that. Think of what helped Sully, of course, he had 10,000 hours in that aircraft, but what helped him a lot was the environment.
Yeah, actually a perfect follow on to that is Angela Duckworth's question with her fancy pants book learning. Angela says, your point that choice architecture's profound influence is invisible. People don't realize, like the default effect reminds me of David Foster Wallace's famous commencement speech, "This is water." Your book's not only for choice architects, right, but also for all of us making hundreds of decisions each day. What's your best idea for jolting people into the insight that, just as you mentioned, their situations influence them and that they can proactively change the situations? How do you teach people, as Wallace would say, that this is water and that I can change my water?
That's a profound question. And it's not just a good question, it's a profound question. And if it's going to be science-based, I don't think we know. We know how not to do it. We know that just saying defaults matter is not going to be enough. What I speculate...
That's a big insight, right? Is that the easy, obvious thing just doesn't work.
Right.
It's going to have to
this
be
is
something
default
much more
or a warning
magical.
you're about to be nudged doesn't work. What it seems to me, but the analogy I use is like I'm fascinated by magic in doing the book. I mean, one of the nice things, by the way, of writing a book like this is you can pursue things that aren't the latest journal article.
Yeah.
And magicians actually do magic in ways that we don't understand. But it turns out once you know how the trick works, not that you're being tricked, but how it works, it's a lot less effective. So, you know, I talk a lot about Darren Brown in the book, who's a great mentalist. And what he does is basically he's not a mind reader, I say, he's a mind writer. And he's basically putting concepts in your mind and pulling them out. And when you see how that's done, you say, oh, I know what he's doing. So it's actually knowing the process by which the thing works, not just he's tricking you, but how he's tricking you. That's most important. So the problem ultimately, Angela, is that there's not just one kind of water. There's lots of things going on, but knowing specifically how defaults work, for example, make default can I think make defaults, but that's speculation. I don't want to say it's science yet.
Right. Yeah. Just to fill in on Darren Brown, tell us, if you can do it in a minute or two. We're doing pretty well on time. What his mind writing is.
So there's actually a great demonstration. Actually, I've used it in class of Darren Brown. Actually, is not only a gifted mentalist; he sort of gives you the trick, and he often thinks about the psychology of these things. And so there's a very nice demonstration where literally it's one of these classic, what card are you thinking of? And before you think of the card, they do very subtle things to actually make you think about it. The trick is they say, imagine it's a square. Now, as I do that, let's see if I can do that anyway. Of course, what I'm shaping is a diamond. And imagine the numbers are here, here, and here, writing the number 3. And it turns out that is actually putting into your mind the 3 of diamonds. And there's a little bit more to it. But that will actually increase the probability that somebody says 3 of diamonds from base rate to about 30%. So in that sense, he's not reading. That trick doesn't read your mind. It's writing into your mind. And there's a lot more things he does, but that's actually a good example of mind writing.
Yeah, that's exactly. Anyway, Eric's book is absolutely magnificent, and that story is, and there are many more, is you need to just read it and let it sit with you. Angela has a follow-up, which you and I spoke about yesterday, which is the Darren Brown mind writing is a kind of priming effect, right? That you're generating subconscious or implicit associations, which actually partly because people don't realize that often influence choice. And it sounds like you believe in priming effects, but the tide in social science has turned against priming, or at least the capacity of certain very flashy experiments, like getting people to think about being old, and then college students walk more slowly out of an experiment because of problems with reproducibility. If you try to do the same exact experiment, you don't always get the same answer. What's going on? Is Darren Brown better at priming than social psychologists?
I think Darren Brown actually is, remember I said it increases the probability. So there's a small effect. What he also does is he's just magical almost. I mean, in how he runs the pattern. So he'll say, you're thinking of a diamond, and they'll say yes. Or if you say, no, it's, so he'll actually respond. It's like cold reading. A mentalist not only, implants things, but they also actually cleverly use every trick in the linguistic book to make you think that they actually are knowing something that you don't know. So I think a part of it is they're just very skilled at that. There's also a difference, after thinking about it a little bit, between these kind of priming, very subtle things, and long-term accessibility. One of the things that is very clear, I teach marketing occasionally, is you ask people what is their favorite, to name beers. The beer they order all the time will be very high, if not number 1 on the list, number 2 or number 3. So I think there's a difference here between these short-term primes and things that we see because we see, the tap at the beer at the bar says Bud. The coaster says Bud. We've seen $600 million worth of advertising teaching us Bud. I mean, that kind of long-term accessibility is very real.
Two more questions. Hassam Rahamian has a question that was popular with other audience members. As a designer, how should we be aware if we're manipulating our audience versus guiding and influencing them in their decision-making process, especially in default settings? You alluded to a lot of ongoing research is focused on exactly this. So people are working hard at it.
Right. I think, the one thing that is true is a mistake people often make is not appreciating defaults and these decisions. These things make a difference. So, it's hard to make people aware, but I think it's a lot easier to make designers aware. And that's sort of, frankly, it's cute, but one of the reasons I wrote the book. Elke
Weber, I hope I'm getting that name right, says, as I'm watching this fascinating interview from Germany with my mother, hi, Mrs. Weber, I hope you're doing well. I'm wondering how general across cultures choice architecture insights and recommendations are. And a couple of other people had a very similar question too.
Nobody expects the German Inquisition. It's a great question. And again, I don't want to claim there's a lot of science on this, but we know that some things like defaults seem to be, very cross-cultural. There's a lot of work done, at least in wired, in weird societies. And I think the answer to that question ultimately will depend upon, are the processes the same? So if we think to go back to the two things that I think cause choice architecture, the fact we have plausible paths, we look at subsets of information, that's going to be close to a cultural universal. The other thing, which I haven't really talked about, is choice architecture works by assembling our preferences. We think about things those are going to be much more culturally specific. So classic example is labeling ground beef as either 7% lean or 30% fat. That's going to be very cultural specific. And so the content's going to matter.
Right. You mentioned that Joe Henrich et al.'s paper on weird societies and how, using only Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic college kids is not going to tell us everything about human psychology. And actually, one of the examples has to do with perception and design, which is, there's a famous illusion some of you will know called Muller-Lyer illusion. You take two lines that are exactly equal, and one of them has two carrots at the end like that, and the other has them facing out. And the one with the facing out looks longer. But in small scale societies, in very remote areas, they have no illusion. So it may be that actually that there are certain design features which we think are universal that have to do with very basic perceptual processes, maybe even including defaults or how things are arrayed on a screen, which if we really wanted to find places where it starts to fall apart. I mean, that's another aspect of culture, which isn't way much has to do with upstream perceptual process.
Let me make one quick comment, which is we assume when we do choice architecture, typically it has the same effect on everyone. And
good. And someone else had a question about that. What about
and some of the work? So yes,
are there some people who are not nudgeable?
One thing, but it turns out we've been looking at this along with Kellen McRae and other co-authors. And it turns out that if you're less expert in the domain, you tend to be more nudgeable. And I do air quotes for that, but you will tend to be, which means something really important, which is decisions not to use choice architecture will actually hurt people who are not well off more than people who are well off.
Oh yeah, interesting.
And there's some really beautiful examples of that. We're going to run out of time, but I think that's actually a really important lesson, is that by not doing good choice architecture, you're actually differentially hurting people who are less knowledgeable about the domain.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Particularly lots of government services, for example, when you apply for food stamps, apparently in some states, they ask how many burial plots you own and how valuable are they. And and it seems they actually have a term for this, which is ordeal costs. It seems like it's almost designed to discourage people from applying for food stamps. And of course, it's going to have a huge differential effect on someone who's not a native English speaker or who's doesn't keep track of their finances as carefully.
I see our wonderful
Our co-hosts are back. Should we do one more question or
change the choice architecture of this?
no,
Yes,
I do
exactly.
want to say one thing first, which is I also want to thank you guys for everything you're doing for both in terms of the series and the research series, but also for the field. I mean, doing these kind of large scale studies and, vaccination is just the latest example. It's just a good example of how we're going to find out what really works. So thank you.
Thank you. And we have really appreciated that you were here as our guest today. And I won't waste everyone's time with how much we admire your work. I will say that I hope, Colin and Eric, you join all of us for the next authors at BCFG event. And that is going to be on Friday, December 3rd at noon Eastern time. And we're doing something a little different. So Eric's book just came out, but we're gonna, in this next event, have a panel of authors who have releases, but not quite as recent as Eric's. And it's going to include NYU professor Dolly Chug, author of The Person You Mean to Be, ASU professor and legend Bob Cialdini, author of Influence, Harvard professor Cass Sunstein, author of, I think at last count, 4 or 6 million books, and that includes Sludge. And then finally, USC professor Wendy Wood, who's the author of Good Habits, Bad Habits. And one more announcement, and I think it's timely. Colin said we should definitely squeeze this in because he thought it might be incredibly popular. You'll soon also receive an invitation to join us for a virtual research briefing on what does and what does not work for encouraging COVID-19 vaccination rates. And that will be on Friday, November 5th, again at noon Eastern time. So be on the lookout for invitations in your inbox. And Eric, I love this book. As you know, Katie and I read every word. And Colin, thank you so much for being a great interviewer.
My pleasure.
It was a treat. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great day.
Bye.